magic messenger. The water's really warm, laughed Rachel Walker. She was sitting on a rock, swishing her toes in one of Rainspell Island's deep blue rock pools. Her friend Kirsty Tate was looking for shells on the rocks nearby. "Mind you don't slip, Kirsty," called Mrs. Tate. She was sitting further down the beach with Mrs. Walker. "Okay, Mum," Kirsty yelled back. As she looked down at her bare feet, a patch of green seaweed began to move. There was something blue and shiny underneath it. "Rachel, come over here," she shouted. Rachel went over to Kirsty. "What is it?" she asked. Kirsty pointed to the seaweed. "There's something blue under there," she said. "I wonder, could it be?" "Sky the Blue Fairy," Rachel said eagerly. Jack Frost had banished the 7 rainbow fairies from fairyland with a magic spell. Now they were hidden on Rainspell Island. Until they were all found, there would be no colour in fairyland. Rachel and Kirsty had promised the fairy king and queen to help find them. The seaweed twitched. Rachel felt her heart beat faster. "Maybe the fairy is all tangled up," she whispered, "like Fern when she landed on the ivy in the tower." Fern was the green rainbow fairy. Rachel and Kirsty had already found Fern and her sisters, Ruby, Amber and Saffron. Suddenly, a crab scuttled out from under the seaweed. It was bright blue and very shiny. Tiny rainbows sparkled across its shell. It didn't look like any of the other crabs on the beach. Kirsty and Rachel smiled at each other. This must be more of Rainspell Island's special magic. "Oh no, fairy in trouble," the crab muttered in a tiny voice. It sounded a bit like 2 pebbles rubbing together. "Did you hear that?" Rachel gasped. The crab stopped and peered up at the girls with his little stalk eyes. Then he stood up on his back legs. "What's he doing?" Kirsty said in surprise. The crab pointed a claw towards some rocks further along under the cliffs. He scuttled away for a few steps, then came back and looked up at Rachel and Kirsty again. "Over there," he said in his scratchy voice. "I think he wants us to follow him," Rachel said. "Yes, yes," said the little crab, clicking his claws. He set off sideways across a large flat rock. Kirsty turned to Rachel. "Perhaps he knows where Sky is." "I hope so," Rachel replied, her eyes shining. The crab scuttled across a stretch of sand. Rachel and Kirsty followed him. It was a hot, sunny day. Seagulls flew overhead on strong white wings. "Rachel, Kirsty, it's nearly lunchtime," called Mrs. Walker. "We're going back to Dolphin Cottage." Kirsty looked at Rachel in dismay. "But we have to stay here and look for the blue fairy. What shall we do?" The little crab jumped up and down, kicking up tiny puffs of sand. "Follow me," he said. Rachel thought quickly. "Mum," she called back, "could we have a picnic here instead, please?" Mrs. Walker smiled. "Why not? It's a beautiful day, and we should make the most of the last 3 days of our holiday. I'll pop back to the cottage with Kirsty's mum and fetch some sandwiches. Only 3 days, thought Kirsty, and 3 rainbow fairies still to find. Sky, Izzy, and Heather. The 2 girls waved as their mums left. Kirsty turned to Rachel. We'd better hurry, they'll be back soon. The crab set off again over a big slippery rock. Rachel and Kirsty climbed carefully after him. Rachel saw him stop by a small pool. There were lots of pretty pink shells in it. Is the fairy in one of the rock pools? She asked. Is it this one? The crab looked into the pool. He scratched the top of his head with one claw, looking puzzled. Then he scuttled away. I guess not, Kirsty said. What about here? Rachel said, stopping by another pool. This one had tiny silver fish swimming in it, but the crab shook his claw at them and kept going. Not this one either, said Kirsty. Suddenly, Rachel spotted a large pool. It was all by itself, right at the foot of the cliff. Let's try that one, she said, pointing. Kirsty ran over. The sky was reflected in the surface of the pool like a shiny blue mirror. Rachel caught up with her friend. She leaned over and looked into the water. The crab scuttled up behind them, his stalk eyes waggling like mad. When he dipped his claw into the pool, the water fizzed like lemonade. Fairy, cried the little crab, lifting his claw out of the water. Blue sparkles dripped off it and landed in the pool with a sizzle. The entire pool was shimmering with magic. Bubble trouble. Thank you, little crab, Rachel said. She crouched down and stroked the top of the crab's shell. The crab waved one claw at her, then dived into the water. He sank to the sandy bottom and scuttled out of sight under some seaweed. Kirsty peered into the pool. Can you see the blue fairy? She asked. Rachel shook her head. Kirsty felt disappointed. I can't either. Do you think Jack Frost's goblins have found her? Rachel said. I hope not, Kirsty shuddered. They'll do anything to stop the rainbow fairies getting back to fairyland. Just then, Rachel and Kirsty heard a sweet voice singing a song. With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row. Oh, Rachel gasped. Do you think it's the little crab? Kirsty shook her head. His voice was all gritty. You're right, Rachel agreed. This sounds tinkly, more like a fairy. I think the singing is coming from that seaweed, said Kirsty, pointing into the rock pool. Rachel peered right in. She could see something unusual in the rippling water. Look, she said. A huge bubble came bobbing out of the seaweed. It floated towards the surface of the pool. Rachel and Kirsty watched, their eyes very wide. There was a tiny girl inside the bubble. She waved at them and fluttered her rainbow-coloured wings. Oh, Kirsty gasped. I think we found Sky, the blue fairy. The fairy pressed her hands against the curved sides of the bubble. She wore a short, sparkly dress and knee-high boots the colour of bluebells. Her she was holding a silver wand. "Please help me," Sky said in a tiny voice like bubbles popping. Suddenly, a cold breeze stirred Rachel's hair. A dark shadow fell across the pool. The glowing blue water turned grey. It was as if a cloud had covered the sun. Rachel looked up. The sun was still shining brightly overhead. "What's happening?" she cried. Kirsty heard a strange hissing, crackling sound. She glanced around in alarm. A layer of frost was creeping across the rocks towards them, covering the beach in a crisp white blanket. "Jack Frost goblins must be very near," Kirsty said, feeling worried. In her bubble, Sky shivered as ice began to cover the pool. "Oh no, she's going to be trapped," Kirsty gasped. Sky's bubble had stopped bobbing. Now it hung very still, frozen into the ice. Sky looked very scared. "Poor Sky, we have to rescue her," Rachel exclaimed. "But how can we melt all that ice?" "I know," said Kirsty. "Why don't we look in our magic bags?" The Fairy Queen had given Rachel and Kirsty bags with very special gifts in them to use for helping fairies in trouble. "Of course," Rachel said. Then she frowned. "Oh no, I've left them in my rucksack on the other side of the rock pools." Goblins on ice. "I'll run back and fetch the magic bags," Rachel said, jumping quickly to her feet. "Okay," Kirsty said. She blew on her hands to warm them. The frost was making the air chilly. "I'll stay here, but hurry." "I won't be long," Rachel promised. She scrambled back over the rocks and onto the sandy beach. Her rucksack was lying where she'd left it. She reached inside and took out one of the magic bags. It was glowing with a soft golden light. When she opened it, a cloud of glitter sprayed out. Rachel slipped her hand into the bag. There was something there, smooth and shiny like a pebble. She pulled it out and looked closely at it. It was a tiny blue stone, shaped a bit like a raindrop. Rachel felt very puzzled. It was pretty, but how could it help? Then the blue stone began to glow in her hand, hotter and hotter, until it was almost too warm to hold. As it grew hotter, it glowed fiery red. Rachel curled her fingers around the raindrop stone in delight. They could use it to melt the ice and set Sky free. She ran back as fast as she could, but when she reached the rocks, she stopped dead. Kirsty was still standing by Sky's frozen pool, but she wasn't on her own anymore. Two ugly, hook-nosed goblins were skating on the ice beside her. "Shoo, go away," Kirsty was shouting at them, waving her hands. Rachel could tell that Kirsty was really angry. Rachel didn't feel quite so scared either, now she'd brought fairy magic to help fight the goblins. "Go away yourself," yelled one of the goblins rudely at Kirsty. He held his stumpy arms out sideways and slid across the ice on one foot, away from her. Kirsty tried to grab the other goblin, but he dodged out of reach. "Can't catch me." "Hee hee, the fairy can't get out," The other goblin laughed. His bulging eyes gleamed as he did a little twirl. "We're going to get her out," Kirsty told him. "We're going to find all the rainbow fairies, and then fairyland will get its colours back." "Oh no, it won't," said the goblin. He stuck out his tongue and screwed up his nose. "Jack Frost's magic is too strong," said the other goblin. "Hey, look at me!" He pointed 1 foot out behind him and whizzed around the pool. But the ice was very slippery. He skidded sideways and crashed right into his friend. Splat! "Clumsy," the goblin snapped crossly. "You should have moved out of the way," grumbled the other one, rubbing his bottom. The goblins tried to stand up, but their feet skidded in all directions and they fell over again in a heap. Rachel saw her chance. She ran to the edge of the pool and threw the magic blue stone onto the ice. Suddenly there was a fizz and a bang. A shower of golden sparks shot into the air and the ice began to melt. A big hole appeared in the centre of the pool. "Ow! Hot! Hot!" yelled the goblins, slithering about on the ice. They scrambled to the edge of the pool and rushed away, their big feet slapping on the rocks. "They've gone," Kirsty said in relief. Rachel peered into the pool. "I hope Sky isn't hurt," she said. All the ice had melted and the water reflected the blue sky once again. Sky's bubble was floating just below the surface. Rachel saw Sky sit up inside the bubble and look around. Her eyes were big and scared and she looked very pale. Kirsty put her hand in the water. It was still warm from the magic stone. "Don't be afraid, Sky," she said. Very gently she poked her finger into the bubble. Pop! Sky tumbled free of the bubble and into the water. She swam up to the surface, her golden hair streaming behind her. Kirsty leaned over and fished the fairy out. She felt like a tiny wet leaf. Kirsty placed her gently on a rock in the sun. "There you are, little fairy," she whispered. Sky propped herself up on one elbow. Water dripped from her everywhere, but there were no blue sparkles now. "Thank you for helping me," she said in a weak voice. Kirsty frowned at Rachel. "Something's wrong. All the fairies we found before had fairy dust. What's happened to Sky Sparkles?" "I don't know," said Rachel, "and she's gone really pale, almost white." It was true. Sky's dress was so pale you could hardly tell it was blue at all. Kirsty bit her lip. It looks as if Jack Frost's magic has taken away her colour. The blue crab scuttled out of the water and made his way across the rock to Sky. Oh dear, he muttered. "Poor little fairy." Sky shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "I'm so cold and sleepy," she whispered. Kirsty felt a pang of alarm. "What's the matter, Sky? Did the goblins get too close to you?" Sky nodded weakly. "Yes, and now I can't get warm." "We've got to help her," Rachel said. "But how?" asked Kirsty. She looked down in dismay at Sky, curled up in a tiny ball with her eyes closed. Rachel felt tears prick behind her eyelids. Poor Sky, she looked really ill. What was going to happen to her? Little Crab's great idea. Rachel spotted something moving. The little blue crab was waggling his front claws madly. "Look," she said. "He's trying to tell us something," said Kirsty. The girls crouched down. "Don't worry," the crab said in his gritty voice. "My friends will help us." He scuttled up to the top of the highest rock and snapped his claws. What's he going to do? Kirsty wondered. Then she stared in amazement. Lots and lots of crabs were coming out of the rock pools around them. Big ones, little ones, all different colours. Their claws made scratchy noises on the pebbles. The blue crab wiggled his eyes and clicked his claws, pointing up at the sky, then down at the ground. His friends pattered away in all directions. Their little stalk eyes waved about as they prodded their claws into the cracks between the rocks. Rachel and Kirsty looked at each other, feeling very confused. "What's going on?" said Rachel. Just then, Kirsty spotted a tiny pink crab tugging and tugging at something. With a gritty crunch, the crab tumbled over backwards. It held a fluffy white seagull feather in its claws. The crab scrambled up again, waving the feather in the air. One by one, the other crabs searched out more feathers. Then the blue crab waved them over to the rock where Sky lay. Very carefully, he tucked the feathers round the blue fairy. His friends brought more and more feathers until the fairy was lying in a cosy feather bed. "They're trying to warm Sky up with seagull feathers," Kirsty said. Rachel held her breath. There were so many feathers now that she couldn't see the fairy at all. Would the blue crab's idea work? She wondered. There was the tiniest wriggle in the feather nest. A faint puff of blue sparkles fizzed up, smelling of blueberries. One pale blue star wobbled upwards and disappeared with a pop. "Fairy dust," Rachel whispered. But there's not very much of it," Kirsty pointed out. There was another wriggle from inside the nest. The feathers fell apart to reveal the blue fairy, her dress still very pale. She opened her big blue eyes and sat up. "Hello, I'm Sky, the blue fairy. Who are you?" she said in a sleepy voice. "I'm Kirsty," said Kirsty. "And I'm Rachel," said Rachel. "Thank you for frightening the goblins away," said Sky. "And thank you, little crab, for finding all these lovely warm feathers." She tried to unfold her wings, but they were too crumpled. "My poor wings," said the fairy, her eyes filling with tiny tears. "The feathers have helped, but Sky still can't fly," Kirsty said. "Maybe the other rainbow fairies can help," Rachel said. Sky looked up excitedly. "Do you know where my sisters are?" she asked. "Oh yes," said Kirsty. "So far we found Ruby, Amber, Saffron and Fern. They're safe in the pot at the end of the rainbow," Rachel added. "Could you take me there, please?" said Sky. "I'm sure they'll make me better." She tried to stand up, but her legs were too wobbly and she had to sit down again. "Here, let me carry you," Rachel offered. She cupped her hands and scooped up the feather nest with the fairy inside. Sky waved at the little blue crab and his friends. "Goodbye. Thank you again for helping me." "Goodbye, goodbye." The blue crab waved his claw. His friends waved too, their little stalk eyes shining proudly. They had never rescued a rainbow fairy before. Kirsty and Rachel glanced at each other as they crunched across the pebbles. Sky was being very brave, but the goblins had got closer to her than any of the other rainbow fairies, and now the blue fairy was hardly blue at all. Back to the pot. Rachel and Kirsty hurried across the fields and into the woods. Rachel carried Sky very carefully. The fairy lay curled in a ball in the warm feathers, her cheek resting on her pale hands. "Here's the glade with the willow tree," Kirsty said. The scent of oranges hung in the air, tickling their noses. Rachel looked round and spotted a tiny fairy. She was hovering over a patch of daisies, collecting nectar in an acorn cup. "Look," Rachel said, "it's Amber the orange fairy." "Hello again, Rachel and Kirsty." Amber fluttered over and settled on Rachel's shoulder. Then Amber saw Sky laying, curled up in Rachel's arm. "Oh no, Sky, what's happened?" "I must call the others," she cried. She waved her wand and a fountain of sparkling orange dust shot into the air. The other rainbow fairies fluttered up all over the clearing. The air sparkled with red, orange, yellow and green fairy dust. Bubbles and flowers, tiny butterflies and leaves sprinkled the grass. Rachel and Kirsty watched as the fairies clustered around Sky. The blue fairy sat up slightly and gave a weak smile, then flopped back into her nest of feathers. "Oh, Sky," cried Fern, the gentle green fairy. "Why is she so pale?" Saffron asked. "The goblins got really close to her," Rachel explained. "They froze the pond. Sky was trapped in a bubble under the ice." "Oh, that's terrible," Saffron shuddered. Kirsty shouted at them and tried to catch them. Sky whispered. "Thank you, you're so brave," said Ruby the red fairy. Then she zoomed high into the air. "We must think of something to help Sky." "Oh, I know. Let's ask Bertram for his advice." The fairy sisters sped towards the willow tree, their wings flashing brightly. Rachel and Kirsty carried Sky over in her feathery nest. The pot at the end of the rainbow lay on its side underneath the willow's trailing branches. The rainbow fairies were living there until all their sisters had been found and they could go back to fairyland. As Rachel put Sky down beside the pot, a large green frog hopped out. "Miss Sky," he croaked, looking pleased. "Hello, Bertram." Sky gave another weak smile. "We have to make Sky warm so she gets her colour back," Fern explained. Bertram looked very worried. "Jack Frost goblins are so cruel," he said. "You must stay close to the pot fairies so that I can protect you." "Don't worry," said Saffron, giving Sky a hug. "You'll soon feel better." Sky nodded, but she didn't answer. Her eyes started to close. She was so pale, her arms and legs seemed almost transparent. Rachel and Kirsty watched the rainbow fairies exchange worried glances. "Oh, Bertram, what if the goblins have hurt Sky forever?" exclaimed Fern. "What can can we do to save her? The fairy ring. Bertram looked very serious. I think it's time for you all to try a spell. Amber frowned. It might not work with only 4 of us. Rainbow magic needs 7 fairies. Bertram's right. We have to try, Ruby said. Perhaps we can manage a small spell. Quick, let's make a fairy ring. The rainbow fairies fluttered into a circle above Sky. Rachel noticed the black and yellow queen bee and a small grey squirrel appear at the edge of the glade. Queenie and Fluffy have come to watch the spell, she whispered to Kirsty. Queenie the bee had helped Saffron to get her wand back after the goblins stole it. Fluffy the squirrel had carried Fern and the girls back to the pot when the goblins were chasing them. Ready, sisters? Said Ruby. She lifted her wand. In a fairy ring we fly to bring blue colour back to Sky, she chanted. The other fairies waved their wands. 4 different colours of fairy dust sparkled in the air: red, orange, yellow and green. The dust covered Sky in a glittering, multicoloured cloud as she lay in a nest of feathers on the soft green grass. Something's happening, Kirsty said. Through the cloud of dust, she could see that Sky's short dress and knee-high boots were turning bluer and bluer. The spell's working. Whoosh! A shimmering cloud of blue stars shot into the air. They drifted up to the sky where they had faded away with tiny pops. We did it, cheered Amber, turning a cartwheel in the air as Saffron clapped her hands in delight. Hooray for magic, laughed Ruby. Sky yawned and sat up. She brushed the feathers away and looked down at herself. Her face lit up. Her dress was blue again. My wings feel strong enough to fly now, she said. She flapped them twice, then zoomed into the air. She did a twirl, her wings flashing with rainbows. Thank you, sisters. The rainbow fairies clustered round Sky, hugging and kissing her. The air around them bubbled with fairy dust, red, orange, yellow, green and blue. It was nearly a whole rainbow. Rachel and Kirsty beamed. Fern swooped down and scooped up an armful of seagull feathers. You won't need these anymore, she laughed, tickling Sky with a long white one. But I think I might know what to do with them, said Sky. She flew down to perch on the edge of the pot and peeked in. It's so cosy, she said, admiring the tiny chairs and tables made of twigs and the giant shell bed. Then Sky fluttered over to the rest of the feathers and gathered them up. I thought we could put these on our bed. They'll be very warm and soft. Her fairy sisters looked delighted. Thank you, Sky. What a good idea, said Ruby. Let's have a welcome home feast, said Fern, with wild strawberries and clover juice. Amber did another cartwheel. Yippee! Rachel and Kirsty, you're invited too. Thank you, but we have to go. Rachel looked at her watch. Our mums will be waiting with our picnic. Oh yes, Kirsty remembered, jumping up. She felt a bit disappointed that she wouldn't have a chance to taste some fairy food, but she didn't want her mum to be worried. Goodbye, we'll be back again soon. The fairies sat on the edge of the pot and and waved to the girls. Queenie, Fluffy and Bertram the Frog waved too. Goodbye, goodbye. Sky fluttered beside Rachel and Kirsty as they walked back across the glade. Tiny rainbows sparkled on her wings. Her dress and boots glowed bright blue, and blueberry scent filled the air. Thank you so much, Rachel and Kirsty, she said. Now 5 rainbow fairies are safe. We'll find Izzy and Heather too, Kirsty said. I promise. Yes, Rachel agreed. As they made their way back to the beach, Rachel looked at Kirsty. Do you think we can find them in time? We only have 2 days of holiday left, and the goblins are getting much closer. They nearly caught Sky today. Kirsty squeezed her friend's hand and smiled. Don't worry, nothing is going to stop us from keeping our promise to the rainbow fairies. And that's that. Thank you so much for listening today. If you have any suggestions of stories you'd like me to read, do leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, until I see you again, stay safe and stay cozy.